Hello, I'm Jason Bristupa, and I'm going to be talking about the history of music in America from 1900 to approximately 1940. Um, I've been studying this subject for many years now. I've been playing guitar and saxophone for about 7 years, and I just have a personal interest in the subject because it kind of reflects America's history, culture, and social and racial implications, and kind of culminates into our music in subtle and not so subtle ways that I think are really interesting. So to start, we have to go to the slavery and indentured servant roots of America to talk about the work songs that they used to sing. These were songs to pass the time that were heavily influenced by gospel, songs of Native Africans, songs of Native Caribbeans, Hawaiians, and it culminated into kind of these work songs that they would sing. And even today, if you listen to them, they sound very much like modern blues and soul music and even some jazz. So you can definitely see the connection between the two. So from these work songs in the post-slavery era, started to emerge organized and assembled blacks with now instruments who could assemble in their own ways and play their own music and take the influences of the work songs and turn them into organized music. So in 1900s and 1905, 1910, that era, they started assembling using more instruments like the saxophone, like early versions of the drum kit, and those kinds of things to make early songs. These songs would travel around the country from the South and kind of culminated in New Orleans, where people like Louis Armstrong and Nat King Cole would start to be able to practice their music more publicly because racism wasn't so heavy in those places like New Orleans or a little bit further west. Um, their music started to travel up the Mississippi River, starting in New Orleans with kind of the improvised jazz, and as it went farther north, it left its influences in places like Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, and it ended up in Chicago, where it met with the structured jazz sound of the big bands of primarily white-dominated music, with people such as Glenn Miller and his orchestra, that song In the Mood, very popular song that came out in the 40s, but it's an example of kind of that big band style swing that started to emerge in the early 20s and the 30s. Also coming out in the late 20s and 30s was more technology to allow people who were in these bands to play more effectively. In 1931 came the first electric guitar known as the frying pan. This was a guitar that looked just like a frying pan, that was about 2 feet long and had a electrical plug and could now be heard over early versions of the drum kits and horns. This allowed guitar players to be more brought out into the spotlight as they would be more over time. Also, the 1920s and 30s brought out more of the blues in places like Mississippi, where I told you how the New Orleans jazz traveled up the Mississippi River. Other people, such as Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, took that influence and made it more blues. This was either individuals or very small bands playing this music, and it was heavily influenced by the work songs and kind of the beaten down sorrow of life at the time for everybody. At the same time this was happening, you had people like Hank Williams who were turning the New Orleans style impromptu jazz, and they turned it more into the other direction towards country and started making more songs that were catered to white people and gospel music. As time went on, World War II kind of split up a lot of the big band era stuff, and you ended up getting more smaller groups of individuals who would be playing music with this new technology, such as the frying pan, which had become more of a standardized guitar by the 1940s. You had drum kits that were being more normalized, and you had everyone going off to war, so that only left a very small specific people to be behind and play music, and they had to figure out ways to play without such big bands. This would kind of introduce a new style of music that would go into the 50s, that would be kind of more of the rock and roll bands, that would become the smaller groups with more of an edge to them, with more rock and roll influences, but it all came from the work songs and the introductions of blues music in the early 1900s. And that's it. That's the beginning of music in America.